I think we'll go ahead and get started. Well, want to welcome everybody here. This is our first installment, if you will, of the SKAY webinar series that we're going to be doing throughout the year here. This is part of our Southern SARE grant that we received to try and provide you all with some information that might be useful with regards to nutrition and genetics and reproduction, where some of this is going to be going on through the year. We'll provide some additional things and kind of outcomes that we're seeing on some research. Greg, for example, got a SARE grant to look at artificial insemination, and we'll kind of reveal some of those results later in the year as we get more of those coming through. But we want to go ahead and kind of share some general knowledge and then also get some feedback from you all. And I think it'll be kind of informal as we go through here. So there's a couple of options that we'll have. You can type in questions using the chat box. So your chat box should be down toward the bottom of your screen. And you can just click on the chat and put that question there, or feel free to use the reactions. As an example, you can use the reaction and raise the hand, and then your hand will come up in your image or where your name is, and we'll know to acknowledge you for a question. And then you can unmute once we say, for example, Trish, you go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll lower your hand. But it'll be pretty informal, and if you've got questions, we'd like to hear them and chat with the speakers and the presenters and get that information as we go through. We've got about 40 signed up on the list, and I think folks will be joining in and out, and I will be recording these sessions, and we'll be posting them to the website for later viewing as well. So if you can't make a session, don't worry. Just reach out to me and I'll let you know when we get those posted so that you can go back and view them later on. So at this time, I guess I didn't introduce myself. I'm Jeff Lumpcooler. I'm a beef extension specialist here at the University of Kentucky. Been working with Greg a couple of years on some on-farm research looking at different forage qualities and types on performance of yaks through the winter. And we did a summer grazing study at Greg's, and then myself and other colleagues have been working with Greg on the reproduction side as well. Tonight, we're joined by my colleague, Dr. Katie VanValin. Dr. VanValin is a nutritionist as well. She did her PhD and postdoc in mineral nutrition of beef cattle, and so she has a good handle on ruminant, just not beef cattle, but ruminant mineral nutrition. And so given that yaks are ruminants, the information can apply pretty directly when we look at trace mineral needs and macro mineral needs as well. So with that, I'm going to end the poll here, and I'll share the responses. Hopefully you all can see those responses. Dr. VanValin, can you see them?
I got them.
All right, so this will give you a little bit of a background as well as you begin to proceed into your session this evening. And so I'm going to be quiet and turn the show over.
One moment here. Okay, let me get this into presentation mode. All right, well, I was pretty excited to see that nobody selected none for their mineral program, so that's good. We're going down the right track with that. So tonight I'm going to try to give you kind of an overview of what minerals do, and maybe some different ways that we can look at supplementing minerals, and different ways that our animals are actually consuming minerals beyond just a mineral supplement, and just give you some things to think about. Even in the beef cattle world, as much research as we've done with beef cattle mineral nutrition, we still have a lot to learn and some things to work out. And so certainly when we work with other ruminant species, whether that's yaks, or I've worked with some folks that raise bison, there's a lot more that we don't know in terms of maybe some particulars about minerals, but we'll go through some high level things and some things to kind of think about. So I like to kind of start off with this slide here. that talks about what minerals are and what they're not. Because I find that a lot of times I talk to folks that say they changed their mineral and all of their problems went away on their farm, or they changed their mineral and it created all kinds of problems. And certainly when we think about a mineral supplement, it's an important part of the diet, but it's only one small part of the diet. So they are a required nutrient, and they are involved in every process throughout the body. So everything that yaks are doing, or our cattle are doing, or we are doing, a mineral is involved there. They can get pretty complex, and so I'll try to keep some of the complexity out of it. But just understand that there's a lot of ways that minerals work with one another that can kind of create this complexity. And so I like to kind of think about minerals as kind of being a supportive role in the diet, right? We have things like protein and fat and carbohydrates that give us energy in the diet. Those are the big players. But without the minerals, the rest of that diet doesn't quite work just right, because we'll see that those minerals are involved in some processes with digestion of nutrients and things like that. But what minerals are not, they're not a fix for poor nutrition or general poor management. So I don't care what mineral product or program that you put out there. If we don't have otherwise good nutrition, if we're not getting that energy and that protein out there, we're going to have issues with production. They're not pixie dust, and I put that kind of up there jokingly, but in all seriousness, sometimes the claims that I hear from minerals that don't always add up. They have some very specific roles and things that they do in the body, and so they're not going to be a fix-all. And like I said, they're kind of a supportive role in all those processes throughout the body. So when we think about ruminants, we can really think about 3 ways that they're going to consume minerals. And it's really easy. We tend to talk about minerals as a supplement because we supplement a mineral. But keep in mind that our livestock are getting minerals from feed as well. So anything that they are consuming, they are getting some minerals, and some feedstuffs are a great source of certain minerals, and others are not. And generally speaking, whether we're talking about forages or something like corn or a protein supplement, they're generally going to be lacking in one or more minerals. They may be adequate in some, but not all. And then another area that we can kind of overlook sometimes is water. So water can be a source of minerals as well, certain minerals in particular. And we can talk a little bit about that being a good thing or a bad thing. But when we think about ruminants, a lot of times we're thinking about forages, right? And we're thinking about the forages making up the bulk of their diet in most situations. And so there's a lot of things that we don't really understand about this idea of mineral availability. So in a forage, so if I have I have my forage sample and I send it off to the lab and they analyze it, and it comes back and it tells me it's got 30 parts per million of zinc. There's a lot of, we don't really have a great understanding about how much of that zinc is actually going to be digestible for the animal. But we do know that there are different factors that can affect the mineral concentration that we find in forages. So things like mineral concentration in the soil. Are we in an area of the country that say selenium deficient in soil versus an area that may actually be selenium toxic, for example? Soil pH has a big effect on availability of minerals to the plant, so that would affect maybe concentration in that plant. Growing conditions, things like plant maturity, all of those are kind of factors that really impact the concentration of and availability of that mineral in the forage. And so the reason I kind of think about that is it really pushes us to think, if we don't know or understand all those factors that can impact that, can we really just rely on a feed analysis to say, yes, we're adequate in all those minerals? knowing that there's so many different complex factors there. There can be minerals in our water sources, and some things that we kind of need to think about are these two top minerals here I call iron and sulfur. Iron and sulfur are both very important, but they're what I call bully minerals. And what I mean by that is they can tie up or cause problems, secondary deficiencies of other minerals, especially some of our trace minerals like copper or manganese, for example. So when we get into situations where we have really high iron, really high sulfur, maybe in the diet, but we've also got some coming in from the water, that's a thing that we don't want to overlook. If we think we've got an issue with too much iron or too much sulfur, we don't want to overlook that. We've got salt on here as well. We think about salt. Salt is really what pushes our animals to want to consume mineral. A lot of our mineral supplements are going to have salt in it. So if we've got salt, higher salt concentrations in our water, that can potentially cause some impacts maybe on supplement intake of minerals. So I've already named off several minerals as I've kind of gone through some examples here. But in general, we talk about minerals kind of in two categories. There's macro minerals and then there's micro or trace minerals. And the biggest difference in these is really how much the animals require. So macro minerals, they just require a higher amount of those. And so we would typically measure that as a percentage of the diet or parts per 100. Whereas if we think about those micro or those trace minerals, that's a much smaller portion of the diet. And so we measure that as parts per million. We can also call that milligrams per kilogram. Those two things are interchangeable. But you can see that there's a whole host of them here. And these would be examples of what would be required. And however, I always want to point out that things like iron and sulfur are ones that you're not going to typically supplement, because we've got enough of those in the diet and we don't want to put too much more in there and cause an issue. So thinking a little bit more about kind of the individual roles or really important things that these minerals are doing. A lot of the trace minerals, for example, are involved with health. So they're involved with the immune system of the animal. Things like zinc, I think are really well known if we think about kind of human side of things. A lot of cold products, over-the-counter cold remedies will have high levels of zinc in them to try to shorten the length of a viral cold. So zinc, copper, selenium, those are all kind of our trace minerals that are involved with health. I mentioned earlier this sort of supportive role with digestion and metabolism of other nutrients. You can see there's a whole host of different minerals on there. A lot of those macro minerals we think about in terms of being important for skeletal growth and maintenance. So bone formation and maintenance, things like calcium and phosphorus are really important for that. And then there's also importance for muscle growth, obviously copper, zinc, selenium, and then, and I apologize, it should be on here, but also reproduction. A lot of these trace minerals especially can play a supportive role in reproduction as well. Things again like zinc and selenium and manganese can play a role there. So do we need to supplement? So these are the published requirements for beef cattle for a whole host of different minerals, okay? And so we don't really have specified requirements yet for yaks, but we'll, if we're just looking at these beef cattle requirements here and making an assumption that at least some of them may apply. Anywhere where I have a red number is a place where that particular feed stuff is deficient in that particular mineral. And so you can see that a number of those feedstuffs are, again, deficient in one or more minerals. They're adequate in others, but there's no perfect feed stuff out there that's gonna get all of the minerals for us in a way that we would not want to supplement anything at all. So when we think about methods of mineral supplementation, that's kind of what we were getting at with the poll. We have things like blocks, like salt blocks, free choice mineral supplementation, loose minerals. We can mix mineral into feeds or supplements like protein tubs. And then we have injectable products out there like multimin or some of the selenium injections that are out there. And of course, we also have other products like boluses, rumen boluses, or paste, and all kinds of different oral supplements as well. So in general, when we think about supplementing minerals with a block, we got to think about what's actually in that block, right? If we're just putting out a white salt block, there's nothing more than sodium and chloride out there. And if you remember the list of minerals I put out there was a lot more than just sodium and chloride on that list, right? Even when we move into some of the different colored blocks, right, whether it's a trace mineral block like the red one here, or there's green blocks and blue blocks that maybe have selenium or different minerals in them. Remember that it's a very small portion of that block that's going to have that mineral in it. The other thing to think about is that salt limits intake. So if I have a white salt block out there and a loose mineral out there, we can actually cause a decrease in the intake of that free choice mineral, because they're getting their fill of salt from that salt block. So giving them options is not always necessarily the best thing to do, because at the end of the day, we really want to make sure they're getting adequate intake of those other minerals as well, and not just salt. So in general, I try to stay away from blocks, because again, keep in mind that about 95 to 98% of those blocks, even the colored ones that do have some other minerals in them, are still going to be 95 to 98% salt. So it's just not providing enough of the other minerals to really be a meaningful source of supplementation. So free choice or loose minerals, these are an easy way to supplement mineral to animals on pasture. So they're formulated for typically 3 to 4 ounce per head per day intake. So it's a small intake, relatively small intake compared to their overall feed intake for the day. And so if we're thinking in that 3 to 4 ounce range, the 50-pound bag will last 50 animals, say 4 to 5 days. When we put those out, typically put them in a covered feeder. And the reason for that is that a lot of minerals, and there are exceptions, but a lot of minerals, if they were to get wet, they can actually some of the minerals will actually kind of go into solution and can actually give off a metallic-y taste. They can also get clumpy, and the animals don't tend to like the texture component of that as well. So typically want to have them in a covered feeder. Of course, there are products like the wind and rain minerals that are designed to take on a little moisture and still be okay. But even if we're feeding a free choice or a loose mineral, remember that not all mixes are created equal. So I can get basically the same product that's in that salt block or that trace mineral block in a bag as well. And technically it's a loose mineral, but it's not any different than what was in that block. So we'll go over a little bit looking at mineral tags here in a few minutes, just to give some pointers and some things to look at. When we think about putting these loose minerals out in a feeder, we want to try to put it in a high traffic area, maybe close to the water. So that way that we're enticing those animals to visit the feeder and get that mouthful of mineral as they're going by. So this is where I might get on my soapbox a little bit when we think about loose mineral. And that's this idea of cafeteria style mineral. This idea floats around and it comes and goes with popularity. I have on here cattle, but in parentheses, I put mammals. And so when we think about other livestock species, is really what that should say. In terms of their ability to have nutritional wisdom, they typically have very little. You and I, as humans, have nutritional wisdom, right? We can go to the restaurant and look at the menu and know what's a healthy choice versus a not so healthy choice. And regardless of what decision we make, we can know the difference. We can know if I'm supposed to be on a high protein diet, I can pick something that's got a little extra protein in it, right? But our cattle, they're driving off of palatability. So they're going for what tastes good. That's what drives their intake. It has nothing to do with metabolic demand. So it has nothing to do with, I feel deficient in this mineral, so I'm going to eat more of it. And that's kind of the concept with this cafeteria style mineral, is that we put each mineral in its own little container, and they're loose mineral, but instead of having it all mixed up together, each one's separate. So they have to visit each container. Again, this idea that salt is really what's driving our intake here, and not necessarily metabolic demand. And so it's salt, it's palatability. And so what you'll find is that animals are gonna go to the mineral that is there, that tastes good to them. The reason why this can become an issue, and I mentioned earlier that minerals are complex, and this little circle here with all the lines and all the minerals around it really gets at the heart of what we're talking about there. And so what can happen is all of those lines go from one mineral to another, and that's a point of interaction with another mineral. And so what that means is, if I get too much iron, for example, I can cause a manganese deficiency. If I get too much sulfur, I can cause a copper deficiency. Just some examples. And so my real concern with this type of program is that we can end up with some kind of secondary deficiencies without really meaning to create that, or we develop a deficiency because, hey, they don't like the taste of the copper that we put out there, and so they're not eating any of it, right? Injectable trace minerals, so those are things like multimin. Multimin contains copper, selenium, manganese, and zinc. They are designed to improve trace mineral status. So they will increase the concentration of those 4 minerals, but just those 4, so not any of the macro minerals or anything like that, in the blood, and then we see it show up in other places like the liver and muscle and things like that where it's utilized. So when people ask, does it work? Yes, it does. So time and time again, we will see. So if you look at these graphs here, this is some work I helped with when I was a grad student at Iowa State. That star is where everybody started. And these were cattle that received either a saline injection, this multi-min injection, or a whole host of multi-mineral drenches, paste, some boluses were on there. There's a selenium bolus on there, and I think the other one was maybe a copper bolus. And so if you look at that star, that's kind of the average of where everybody started. We gave the multi-min injection to those cattle, and you can see that their selenium in their blood went up pretty quickly, about 8 hours later, but then it drops off pretty quickly. Next graph over here shows the same cattle, just looking 48 hours later in the liver. And that makes sense. So when we give that injection, it goes through the blood, and then it's going to go to the liver. And so you see that big increase in liver concentrations here. But again, you see it drop down pretty quickly over the next couple of weeks. And then they're actually kind of here with everybody else. And this is a really important concept when we think about minerals, because if our cattle or our livestock don't need the mineral, the body's going to work really hard to regulate it and keep it at a certain level in the body. Because at the end of the day, these minerals are heavy metals. And so the body doesn't want to create a toxicity. And so that's why we see this sort of rapid decrease and kind of level out where everybody else is because actually none of the cattle in this study were deficient when we started. So if they had started at a deficient level, then that line might look a little different. So when I say doesn't improve trace mineral status, yes. However, when we look at what the data shows in terms of performance measures, things like reproductive success, growth, health, and stress, then it becomes a lot more variable. And I think that really gets back to this idea of whether or not the animals actually needed the minerals at that time. So this one is one that a product you can get from your veterinarian. I do always caution folks to read the label on it. Make sure that we're giving it as directed, because we are giving a big concentration, a big old slug of some of these minerals, and things like selenium have a pretty narrow window of safety from where we go from adequate to toxicity. And if we are giving the wrong dose, we can cause selenium toxicity, which is often fatal. So, and it happens before you even necessarily realize that you have a problem. So it's not that the products aren't safe. We just have to read the directions or follow the directions from our veterinarians. Other options would be to have mineral mixed into feed. So if we're feeding a supplemental feed, we can have it mixed right in. We need to kind of have an idea of how much feed we're feeding so that we can work to make sure that the concentrations there are right. Top dressing mineral is another potential option. And then, of course, I have on here proteins or tubs, other supplements that may come with the mineral already mixed in. So those are some maybe some other convenient options where, at least in these situations where the minerals kind of being mixed in, or you're putting it right on top when the animals are coming up to eat, then we kind of have a little better idea of how much they're actually consuming, versus something like a loose mineral out in the pasture. We know there's going to be variation in mineral intake, throughout the year, from day to day, from animal to animal, and that kind of thing. So these options, maybe we limit that a little bit, although arguably with the protein tubs, you're still going to have some differences in intake. So kind of going over, looking at mineral tags or feed tags in general, on this guaranteed analysis section up here lets us know how much of each of those minerals is in that particular bag, or 50-pound bag of mineral for this example. The ingredients section, that's going to let us know what kind of minerals are in there. Do we have what sources of some of those trace minerals are in there? And then of course we've got instructions for feeding and that sort of thing on there. So those are kind of the big areas that I want to look at when I'm trying to compare minerals is what's in that guaranteed analysis. Keep in mind that there can be minerals in the ingredients section. So there are certain minerals in that bag that may not show up in that guaranteed analysis. The problem is we don't really know how much. So we only really know what's actually in that guaranteed analysis because those feed manufacturers are held to some regulatory standards to make sure that if it says it's at least got 5,000 parts per million of manganese, that in fact it does have at least 5,000 parts per million of manganese, for example. So sources of trace mineral, I feel like this is an area where marketing, the marketing departments of some of these mineral manufacturers can go a little haywire and talk about bioavailability. That's a big buzzword in the mineral world. And there are differences for bioavailability of minerals. And so basically that's a big fancy word that means how much of the mineral that the animal consumes is actually being used. So if one mineral has higher bioavailability than another, then presumably that would be a better source. However, if we are pretty much adequate in our mineral regardless, we may not need to have a more bioavailable source. So in general, in Kentucky, at least where we're from, and thinking about cattle, copper and selenium are two that I typically think that having a more bioavailable source can help. Whereas things like zinc and manganese are really abundant in forage-based diets, and so we maybe don't need to supplement with a more bioavailable source. Because as you can imagine, if something's more bioavailable, it's a little better product. It comes with a better price, a higher price tag. So that just makes our supplements more expensive. And is another important thing to consider when we're at our local farm store, maybe trying to look over mineral tags and trying to figure out why this bag is $40 and this bag is $20. Keep in mind that source of mineral may be playing a role in there. And so kind of looking through that ingredient section can tell you that. So inorganics are the type of mineral that's mined from the earth. So things like oxides and sulfates. So things like zinc sulfate, for example, or copper oxide, for example. Organic trace minerals. So this has nothing to do with the mineral being USDA organic programs or anything like that. It's basically the mineral is bound to some kind of a carbon containing molecule. So going back to some chemistry there, that's where the name organic minerals comes from. So typically on a feed tag, that's going to read something like zinc methionine, or maybe a copper lysine, or a zinc amino acid complex is another example of something that you might see written on that tag. Hydroxy minerals, they are they're different than a traditional inorganic, but they're also not an organic mineral. They're kind of their own thing. And so examples of those are things like zinc hydroxy chloride, so it's got the name hydroxy in the name, or basic copper chloride, and that one's a little misleading because it doesn't actually have the name hydroxy in there. But in general, they have more improved bioavailability, but tend to be maybe a little more price competitive than some of the organic sources. So if I'm looking at a mineral and it's got some zinc hydroxychloride or especially basic copper chloride, then that's something that I might be interested in. Again, if I'm worried about a potential copper deficiency. So this is just a couple of different feed tags. And so again, we can see zinc sulfate, copper sulfate in that top one. This bottom one, we've got that zinc amino acid complex, copper amino acid complex. But I will point out that this bottom one also has copper sulfate and zinc sulfate. So it's actually got multiple sources of these minerals. So same thing, we've got selenium yeast, which is an organic form of selenium, and sodium selenite, which is another source of selenium. So it's got a blend of these. Now, what I can tell from this is that there's a blend. It's got multiple sources, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, the data on selenium and even some of the copper data that we have actually suggests a mixture of sources is better than either source on their own. But what I can't tell from here is how much. I can't tell if this is a 50-50 blend, a 75-25% blend. But that's something that if we are working with a good feed retailer, they should be able to help us get some of that information. So again, that's some of the information that's not on the tag. We're not going to be able to necessarily know from looking at a mineral tag what source is more bioavailable than another. So that's just kind of knowing some of those key buzzwords maybe to look for on there is what I tell folks to kind of keep in mind. So, and of course, as I mentioned, the minerals that are not in the guaranteed analysis, but are listed in the ingredient section, we're not going to know how much of those are in there just from looking at the tag. So earlier and this is looking at basically two guaranteed analysis sections from a block or a free choice mineral. This just happens to be the basic cow-calf mineral that Dr. Limcooler and I update periodically. About once a year. We kind of go back, meet, and look over the research and see if there's anything that we need to change or update in this for the cattle mineral. But if you see the difference right here, I mean, the difference in salt, 94 to 99% of that block is salt versus 22 to 25% in that free choice mineral. And then of course you can see the differences in some of the other minerals that are or not in there. The other thing that I want to point out here is that in a loose mineral or some of our free choice minerals, and in some of our tubs and things like that, we can often get the supplements of vitamins that cattle need, or livestock need, vitamin A and vitamin E. We can get those in the mineral, whereas in the block, we're not getting any of that supplementation. So we don't want to overlook vitamins. We don't tend to talk about them as much with ruminant animals as we do maybe some of our monogastrics, like the pigs. But that's because ruminants can actually produce a bunch of the vitamins on their own. So all of the B vitamins that we think about, or if we take a B complex supplement ourselves, vitamin C and vitamin K can actually all be produced by the rumen microbes. So that sometimes they need the help of some other things. Actually, cobalt, the mineral cobalt, the reason they have that requirement is it's actually required to produce one of the B vitamins. That's actually all the cobalt is doing. Vitamin D supplementation is not necessarily required unless these are animals housed in total confinement. Typically, they can get enough vitamin D just from converting sunlight. But vitamin A and E are ones that we typically supplement. In general, leafy green forages are good for both, are good sources of both vitamin A and vitamin E. But when we think about times when leafy green forages aren't as abundant, say during a drought or something like that, and as we go through the winter, we can run into issues with deficiency, especially vitamin A tends to be what we see more issues with. In terms of identifying mineral deficiencies, this is another area where minerals get to be complicated. And that's because of this graph right here. So there's this whole area. So if we look at mineral intake, that's going to be this blue line over time. So as mineral intake decreases over time, initially we're going to have what we call subclinical deficiencies. So we might give up a little bit of immune function, maybe a little growth, maybe some reproductive performance, but it's not very obvious. It's not a whole herd wide train wreck. We aren't having calves being born with deformities and things like that. It's just not that obvious. But we are giving up some performance. It's out here when we get into clinical deficiency, that's when we start to see the classic kind of clinical signs of several of these mineral deficiencies. And unfortunately, by the time we've gotten out here to clinical signs, that's really a time when we're calling the veterinarian. If we can address subclinical deficiencies, and it's how do you address something that you can't really see or measure, right? And that's why I always encourage that we have a good mineral program in place to try to keep us out of this subclinical range, and certainly keep us out of that clinical range. So again, they're difficult to identify. Even if we have excellent record keeping, I think sometimes it's still hard to identify. If we just have one animal that had an issue or something like that, there's so many different things that can cause those problems that it's often difficult to blame it on mineral. And I'll kind of touch on another point with that. For a lot of these minerals, they're hard to measure. So it's not as simple as just taking a blood sample and saying, oh, they're deficient, because the body will work really hard to keep that blood concentration right where it should be, and give up function in other parts of the body. So basically the mineral is in the blood. So if we take a blood sample, we don't see a deficiency, but that means the mineral, if they are approaching deficiency, the mineral's not actually doing its job. So hopefully I explained that well enough. It just makes it complicated to identify some of these problems until we get into real severe train wrecks. And the goal here is that we don't get into those severe train wrecks. So I just wanted to kind of touch on a couple that are kind of important Urinary calculi or creates a condition called water belly. Basically, those are stones that form. And it results when we don't have a proper balance of calcium to phosphorus. So, and this is really coming from beef cattle. And we're going to try to extend that out to some other ruminant species. But we typically find calcium to phosphorus in a 2-to-1 ratio. That's what the animal's requirements are. In a lot of our grain-based feedstuffs, for example, that ratio is actually inverse. So we have a lot of phosphorus and not enough calcium. And so we have to supplement calcium to flip-flop that back and get that on the right side. And that's a very easy way to prevent something like the formation of urinary calculi. By the time that we know that this has happened, again, there's not a lot that we can do. It's really much more about prevention in the first place. Another thing that we see is polioencephalomalacia, polio for short. And that's a neurological disease that we see with high levels of sulfur. So total diet, sulfur should be less than 0.3%. If we go from 0.3 to 0.5, we can actually have death of the animal. So we can see really high concentrations of sulfur in some of our co-product feeds. But again, if we're kind of on that borderline of having high sulfur, and then we also have high sulfur in our water, that can kind of be the tipping point. And so again, sulfur in the water is something that, again, if we're worried about something like polio, we wouldn't want to ignore. Other things to think about is grass tetany. That's a condition where we have high potassium in the grass and we get low magnesium in the blood. And so we typically see this in the spring when we get that big flush of grass. And that's why we put out something like a high mag mineral. It basically has a higher concentration of magnesium than what we would normally feed throughout the rest of the year to help overcome that low magnesium issue that we're seeing. Selenium deficiency is something that can have issues with fertility, retained fetuses, so just overall reproductive performance. In young animals, and again, I have cattle on here, but in young animals, we can see things like white muscle disease, where they have weak muscles that can lead to death. And so the complicated thing with selenium, I mentioned earlier that it's got a really tight window from deficiency to adequacy to toxicity. A lot of these minerals have what I call kind of a mile-wide range. Selenium's much smaller. And so if you look at this map of the United States, that medium blue color on there is a place that's both adequate and inadequate in the same location. So if you look at places like Kentucky and other parts of the Mid-South, and then also out in the West, we have a lot of areas that it's a toss-up, right? We have places where selenium is adequate, and then we also have places where we know it's going to be deficient. And then we also have these black dots here, and that is places where toxicity may be a problem, and it's because some of the natural vegetation that is found in those locations are what they call selenium accumulating plants. And so the plant can just accumulate a boatload of selenium, and if our grazing animals were to consume that, it could cause toxicity. So knowing that this can be quite variable, I caution folks to not overdo it with supplementation, because just because a little is good doesn't mean more is better. If we're getting selenium in our feed or in our mineral supplement, we don't necessarily need to always be putting an injectable necessarily on top of that. Vitamin A deficiency can cause issues with night blindness and other things, and reduced growth, conception rates, and that kind of thing. And I put this on here just because, again, sometimes we overlook the vitamins. And if we find ourselves in a situation where leafy green forages are not a big portion of the animal's diet, then we may actually be in a situation where we can cause a deficiency. But I will point out that our animals, ruminant animals, are able to store vitamins and some of these other minerals in their liver for quite some time. So it's not something that you're going to necessarily see the effects of overnight. This is something I put together back in the fall, just kind of looking at the actual cost of supplementation. And so, yeah, and this is annual cost for a cow for a year based on what their daily intake should be. So absolutely a complete mineral, whether that's got all inorganic selenium or it's got the sources of selenium that we're looking for. It's got some organic selenium in there, for example. Of course, that does come at a higher cost, but I pointed out in this particular example what the cost of the value of those particular animals were at that given time, and noting that vitamins and mineral deficiencies are going to result in things like poor growth, health, and reproductive performance, which ultimately, as we're thinking about whether we're thinking about our ability to make a profit with our livestock, or we're just thinking about the general well-being of our livestock, those are all things that are important. So things to kind of think about: supplements will help us prevent a deficiency, but more is not always better. So we don't want to get into a situation where we're supplementing minerals left and right from different kinds of different forms, because again, remember that complicated wheel with all the lines. We could run into an issue with an antagonism. If we are looking at mineral products, whether we're looking at feed tags or comparing between two loose minerals, take some time to kind of look over what that tag tells you, and keep in mind that maybe it might be down in that ingredients section. It might be the answer as to why one bag is more expensive than the other. At the end of the day, we really need to provide a balanced mineral program. So that's why I always recommend feeding a complete mineral program that's been formulated so that we have adequate levels of things like calcium and phosphorus, and we're not causing some unforeseen issues due to all those relationships or antagonisms that these minerals have. So that's all I've got for you guys. I know that's probably a lot. I could go on about minerals for a long time. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have.
Excellent. So again, if you've got questions, you can put those in the chat, or you can unmute and ask those. Dr. VanValin, I've got a couple for you to start off to think about. And
Yep.
All right, let's talk about hair coat color. And thinking about a lot of yaks are going to be either black or black and white. Sorry, Greg and Bob, we're going to skip over the white ones for right now. Indications of a trace mineral deficiency on black hair coat color.
Yeah, so copper, for example, actually is involved in a protein that's important for pigmentation. So if we see an animal that should have black hide or black hair coat, and they start getting to be kind of a khaki color, that might be an indication of a copper deficiency. However, I will also point out that in some of that's not always, we can't just say, oh, well, they all look black, they're good to go. Some of the work that I did in my PhD work with copper, we actually created a very severe copper deficiency in some feedlot cattle, and you couldn't tell a difference between the ones that had a deficiency and the ones that didn't, just looking at their hair coat. So hair coat's not always it's not a perfect indicator, but it can be something that you look into and keep in mind. So, but just also keep in mind that some of those animals that were very, very deficient were also solid black. So
One of the things that we note when, typically we get the calls on the train wrecks and pregnancy rates are 60, 65%. What happened? And we begin doing some investigative work and find out it's a white salt block and no other trace mineral supplements, and get them to switch over, and they say, oh my gosh, I see a notable difference in the sheen of the hair coat. The animals just seem more thrifty. And I think maybe it's part of what you mentioned on the enzymes and the digestibility of and protein enzymes needed in the body, that the overall plane of nutrition of the animals elevated as well.
Yep. Okay, yep. So the 3 ounce per day consumption on minerals, is that based on body weight? Not necessarily. So it's not, you won't see a tag that reads it should be 3 ounces for a 1,000-pound animal versus 4 ounces for a 1,200-pound animal or something like that. They are typically formulated. They're going to be formulated. In this case, that example was for cattle. If you look at something that's formulated for sheep, that's going to be they do actually typically have a lower intake in those products. So exactly what the adequate intake on yaks or some of our other ruminant species that we work with that don't necessarily have their own product on the market, I think that's still something that we're yet to figure out. But I would put them closer to cattle than I would a sheep, for example. And then, and also just thinking about too, those cattle minerals, those even though they're formulated like for cow calf, we also know that our calves are coming up and consuming those minerals as well. And they're formulated in such a way that those animals can do that. And so I'm just thinking from a smaller animal standpoint and a safety standpoint.
There's a question here. Are there specific minerals formulated for better fiber production, particularly what might we know in regards to sheep and some minerals that might help with better fiber production that might relate over into yaks?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I do know that some of the trace minerals are important in fiber production. Zinc is the one that comes to mind. Although I will tell you my saying for zinc is it's in everything. So if I'm ever looking for a default answer, it's probably zinc. But I do in fact know that zinc and some of the other trace minerals are important for fiber production. But in terms of what kind of response you would see, again, going back to that, if you think that multi-min graph I showed you where the animals decrease that level really, really quickly because they didn't actually need it, same thing's going to be happening here. So if you say you fed a lot more zinc because I said it was good for fiber production, if they didn't actually need the zinc, you're probably not going to see a response. So as long as they're adequate, then you're probably not going to see a response. But if you had a deficiency and you change that supplementation, then you'll see that response.
And that's another good point, because sometimes we'll chase a single mineral, and by overfeeding zinc, you may actually induce a deficiency in another by kind of competitive absorption. And so now they may not be able to absorb as much manganese or zinc or copper if you've got too much zinc, right?
Yep, exactly. We can cause those what I call kind of a secondary deficiency. We're feeding enough manganese in theory, but we're just overfeeding something else that's causing that deficiency.
And I think in sheep, sulfur is important because if I remember right, cysteine is an amino acid that causes some of the crimp. And so cysteine is a sulfur containing amino acid. And so sheep that are deficient or marginally deficient in sulfur in their diet may not produce as much cysteine. And so you can see a lower crimp in sulfur deficiencies.
Yep. Yeah, and sulfur is one of those too that we can, in theory, can have a deficiency, but we can also have a toxicity that causes a lot of issues as well. So always more sulfur is not always better.
Here's a good question. Hair loss around the eyes, would that be indicative of a mineral deficiency?
It's a great question. I'm trying to think off the top of my head if there's any that really would be indicative of hair loss in other species. And I'm not coming up with anything that right off the bat that would be a mineral issue.
Typically more vitamin related, as I recall. And it can be vitamin A as an example, as a potential deficiency. And I'm with you. I don't recall any minerals being directly involved in hair loss.
Yeah, and the other, I mean, and oftentimes my go-to when I start seeing hair loss issues would be some type of a parasite, external parasite or something like that too. So may not be a nutritional problem, but I may also not know that answer. So
I wanted to ask a quick question. So we don't, even in some of the work that's published with mineral nutrition in regards to yaks, they'll look at the beef requirements and they'll bring those down a little bit because they haven't really been defined. And we know that there's different requirements for different breeds. For example, in cattle, Jerseys, and maybe some of our continental breeds like Limousin and Simmental, we know there's differences in trace mineral requirements for them, right?
Yes and
to
no.
A degree.
Yeah, it's to a degree, but also when I didn't highlight this, and I probably should have. When we talk about these published requirements, it is the level to prevent a deficiency. So it's not a level to optimize performance. And that's a big kind of misnomer, if you will, about when we talk about requirements. And so we know in some of the individual research that we see these breed differences, and generally it's breed types, that we see bigger differences, like you mentioned, some of the Jerseys versus in continental breeds. But in general, I don't think we know enough or have a repeatable enough experience to publish different requirements based on breed for all the minerals. And so that's why oftentimes you see a single requirement for all the minerals for all cattle. And the other thing is that those requirements, even in cattle, don't really change a whole lot, whether I'm talking about a bull or a growing animal or a cow. Cows and heifers do have a little bit higher manganese requirement, but that's really the only one that's a lot different from a trace mineral standpoint specifically. And a lot of that's because it's based on intake. And so my thought is if you're dealing with a smaller animal, their intake is lower, and so it's kind of adjusting itself down or up as need be.
Yeah, and I know, for example, Jerseys are more sensitive to copper, and so their requirements are lower. And when we think about sheep, sheep have a very marginal line between adequacy and toxicity.
Yes.
And I don't know that we are to the point that we know enough about yaks to say that we need to be given a copper bolus, we need to be given a multi-min shot, and we need to be given organic copper, because I do have the fear that we could be inducing some marginal level of toxicity, or we could get to that point if we're not careful, because these animals may have evolved in areas where copper is relatively low to begin with, and we're artificially raising the bar.
Yeah, and that's an important copper specifically when we think about ruminant animals compared to other species. And there's differences amongst ruminants, but they absorb and store copper like a sponge in their liver. And so in things like pigs, for example, they're going to excrete much more copper, whereas our ruminant animals just keep putting it in the liver. And so you can see extremely high or extremely low concentrations of copper in beef cattle. So I'm talking going from 2 parts per million all the way up to 950 parts per million are ones that I've personally seen, which is wildly different in terms of deficiency and toxicity. And like I said, once it kind of gets in that liver, if for whatever reason, they tend to absorb and hold on to that. And that's where the sheep get into trouble, because their threshold to hold on to that is much lower than that of most of our beef cattle.
So this leads me into a little bit of a discussion, because I don't see any chat questions yet, but you had expressed interest in doing a little project with yaks and getting some samples in. You want to share a little bit about what that project is and the goals of that and what tissues are needed?
Yeah. So we specifically were looking at copper, and one of the reasons why copper is a nice place to start when you start trying to maybe understand what the mineral requirements of yaks are would be because we can actually measure copper. So I mentioned I've seen liver copper concentrations going from 2 parts per million to 900 parts per million. Whereas something like zinc, for example, if I were to take 100 different liver samples from 100 different animals, I guarantee you they're all going to be about 100 parts per million of zinc. It does not change, whereas copper changes in response to how much copper the animal is consuming. It changes in the liver, and we can also see some changes in the blood. Liver is much more responsive, but we do see some changes in the blood as well. We can typically see a deficiency in the blood versus a toxicity. So we'll point that out. But there's some other enzymes that use copper that, again, we can tell if based on how much copper the animal's eating, if that enzyme is lower in the blood, then that may be indicative of a deficiency. So copper is a really nice place to start, especially if we wanted to try to figure out is the beef requirement kind of where we need to be, or maybe we need to be lower or higher, because we can actually measure differences. So the whole goal of that study is to get some blood samples, and then if we are taking yaks to harvest, get liver samples at harvest, and we will analyze those for copper concentration, and we will also look at a protein called ceruloplasmin, and that's a protein that uses copper, so it helps us understand if there's a deficiency or not, in addition to that blood concentration level of copper as well, because again, we don't really know what the blood concentration should be, so maybe by coupling this kind of 3-part sampling of being able to look at ceruloplasmin, blood copper, and liver copper, and then also getting some background information in terms of what kind of copper these yaks have been consuming from a forage standpoint or supplementation standpoint, we can start to maybe piece together where what I call kind of a break point is if we have some that are low versus some that are adequate, we might be able to, as we get enough data points in there, we can start to maybe suss out where that requirement might be, because again, that concentration of blood is going to be about the same until it's not, and so until they create a deficiency. So there will be a very obvious kind of break point when we have a deficiency. So we can match that up with copper intake, then we might be able to start understanding requirements of copper. So some of the other minerals are much more difficult to measure. They require things like total collection of all the urine and feces coming out of the animal and all of that. So this is kind of a low-hanging fruit to get started, would be copper. So
I put up and shared the protocol, and so we're looking at a couple different samples from the blood, and then a liver sample, and particularly for harvested animals. So if anyone is doing meat animals, you can get the livers pretty easy that way. And so we'd be looking at collecting blood samples out maybe 10 to 14 days before slaughter would be fine. and then those samples would all be spun down or allowed to be processed. You can work with your veterinarian to pull those blood samples, and they'll have the blood tubes, or you can reach out to us and we can send you the blood tubes if you need those. We've got several in the lab and on hand. And then when you get an animal processed, it just takes a small liver sample that's frozen, right? They'll keep
Yep.
once they're frozen.
Yep. Yeah, the mineral doesn't go anywhere. So once we get it frozen, it's good to go. It won't change its concentration or anything.
Any other quick questions for Dr. VanValin?
Yeah, this is Bob. I have a question. What does copper toxicity look like?
Great question. So in sheep, unfortunately, it happens rather quickly, and we tend to find dead animals. Is the first sign that we have a problem. And so typically, what we find is that kind of a hallmark, I guess, if on necropsy, so post-mortem, mortem looking at those animals, is this gunmetal color in their kidneys. But in terms of live animal copper toxicity, you may have some just general unthriftiness, weakness, and that kind of thing. But like I said, I tend to find that it can happen pretty quickly, that these animals are in general prey animals, and so we don't always necessarily pick up on the symptom before we have a major problem. So I wish there was a hallmark sign that we could get in there and correct that very quickly, but my experience has been, in just talking to most veterinarians, is it's usually diagnosed after we've found animals that have succumbed to that. So, and like I said, and I mentioned unthriftiness or unwell, and unfortunately that could be a whole host of things. That's the complicated thing with minerals and other diseases, is so many times the symptoms all overlap. So unless we know, for example, that, hey, wait a second, I just switched mineral a day ago, and now I all of a sudden have a problem, unless there's just something that really triggers it to be a mineral, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to diagnose that.
Go ahead.
The symptom of copper toxicity is, you find a dead animal and you're just not good. That's the only symptom.
That's been most of my experience. Like I said, or you can catch them, but usually they're weak, unwell, and very close to dying. That's kind of been my experience with them, is that it happens very quickly. And that's usually why if we've lost an animal unexpectedly and we get it necropsied, the lab will do a mineral analysis on some of that liver tissue typically, to help kind of understand if it was a mineral toxicity issue, or even like I said, some of that the signs that you can see in some of the internal organs, but of course those are internal, so they're not something that we're seeing outwardly looking at the animal.
Yeah, and that jaundice, as you begin seeing the organs shut down, Bob, you get jaundice and other things, but in most instances, by the time you see that, it's probably too late.
Yeah, the reason I ask is I give them a lot of copper. I do copper boluses, and then I do a Purina wind and rain mineral bucket, and then I spread Wolf Range minerals on top of it with a copper maximum of 4,636 parts per million. So it's a lot of copper.
And I think that's why I wanted just to bring this up, Bob, because I think there is the risk of over supplementation, and we can begin seeing some depression. We can see it begin impacting some reproductive efficiencies. So,
yeah, that subclinical versus clinical on the deficiency side, we can see kind of that same thing on the toxicity side as well. As you start to have a toxicity, it may not be as apparent as a dead animal, but it's not noticeably apparent. It's a little depression in reproductive performance or something like that we may not notice, or we may equate to something else and not realize that it is a mineral issue, or more likely we usually blame the mineral when it might be an energy issue or something like that.
Katie, there's a question in about horn development and horn growth and the role of minerals in that. And again, I think they're not like deer antlers, where we know that calcium and actually protein and those are really important, but they're probably more keratin based, and thinking about tissues like hoof growth and that, and some of the trace minerals involved.
Yeah. So some of the trace minerals are important for things like hoof health. Zinc, for example, is, and again, I pick on zinc, but truly zinc has kind of been shown to be important for things like hoof health, especially the dairy world has really done a lot of that work because they were seeing issues with those cattle being in confinement and on concrete and that kind of thing. So potentially, but again, kind of like going back to the hair coat, there could be a whole host of other issues, including environmental issues or other dietary issues. It's hard to always pinpoint like that it's truly a mineral issue, but we do know that minerals are involved with hoof health, especially some of those trace minerals.
Also, for Eric's question about hair around the eyes, I've had yaks for a while, and I'm convinced that low copper means a loss of hair around the eyes. I'm convinced. But I have scientific proof of that. It's just that if I have a yak that has lost hair around the eyes, if I give him copper a couple of months later, he's fine.
That's good to know. And
Yep.
and that, I mean, they could differ from other species, and that's why I think Bob, we don't really know what those requirements are. They've really not been defined. There's a lot of serum, right? We can look in the literature and the research, and we can find tons of blood samples that have been analyzed, but we don't have any symptoms or production responses when supplementation goes in. And I think Dr. VanValin mentioned that some of the faults even in the cattle research are we don't know if they're truly deficient before a supplement goes in because they didn't measure maybe liver values and those things.
Yep.
Here you go, Dr. VanValin, and this one. How did yaks obtain the copper requirements in Tibet? So I don't think you probably know the answer to that, and I can tell you a little bit about what I know from reading the literature is there isn't any really. So in a lot of the reference looking at the Indian research and then the Asian research that's been published in like the Journal of Australasia, Animal Science and others, it's based off of cattle requirements. And they reduce the cattle requirements. And I believe, Dr. VanValin, it's reduced as a function of body weight being lighter.
Yeah.
And so what they've done is they pulled serum samples, and that's about it.
Yeah. And like I said, the hard thing on that serum is if you don't have anything else to relate that back to in terms of a loss in production or a loss of enzyme function or something to tie that to, it's hard to know it's hard to interpret that serum value, because it could just be that we know there's species differences in what normal copper might be, for example, or some of the other minerals and that kind of thing, that there would be maybe some differences in normal, and we just don't know what normal is for yaks.
Here's a good question. When reading labels on free choice tags, is there a red flag or rule of thumb if the ppm is too high of any particular mineral, or how to steer clear of some to maybe avoid some issues with yaks, either too much or too little, as an example?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In terms of regulation of what's in these minerals, the only one that's truly regulated in terms of how much can be supplemented is selenium. And so that's why you'll always, if you look at a tag, you'll see a note about selenium, and it'll say something along the lines of formulated to not provide more than 3 milligrams per head per day of selenium. And so I tip in terms of telling you not to buy a certain product because if it has X amount of copper, for example, for a yak, I don't think we know enough just yet to go off of that. But typically, in a lot of the cattle minerals, we are starting to learn in cattle that more copper is not necessarily a good thing from a performance standpoint. And so I think from that particular mineral, for example, we're starting to recognize that in formulation. And I mean, we could, most of those are basically formulated to provide whatever the NRC or whatever that requirement is of that particular mineral, and not to feed a ton over that requirement as a supplement, if that makes sense. So you feed 100% of their requirement. But in terms of a hard number or red flag number, I really don't have one. Like I said, even on selenium, you won't necessarily see it because that one is regulated. Because that one we know has a very tight window, whereas a lot of these other minerals have a little wider margin of safety from deficiency to toxicity.
And I think, Eric, the other challenge on that I would say is that it is impossible to make a blanket recommendation across the entire country because of the issues. And I'll just give you an example. When I was in Wisconsin, selenium deficiencies were much greater of a problem than they are down here. And we only had grass tetany one time, and that was when we bought hay. And so we didn't need to supplement magnesium to the beef herd. And these were spring calving cows. So that's when it's at the highest risk. And so the regionality, soil type differences, soil concentrations, those play in the role there. And it makes it very difficult then when we move into species like yak that we don't really know the requirements to begin with, and then factor in all these other variations in regionality. So the other challenge is and Greg can chime in here too, but I think our understanding is that a lot of you all have seen difficulties in getting yaks to consume loose free choice minerals based on kind of the beef cattle formulas. And part of that might be the salt level, because lighter animals tend to have a lower ability to consume salt. It's based on kind of a body weight basis. And when we're formulating a mineral for a 4-ounce intake on a 1,400 pound animal, and you're dealing with a 500 to 600 pound yak cow, then that intake is probably going to be potentially could be lower because they just don't need as much salt and aren't craving as much salt. But there could be other palatability issues that come in there too.
Your map of selenium toxicity and those black dots, either in one or right on the edge of it. And that's how do I find out more about that selenium black area?
I would say if you are in an area that's close to it, I would reach out to your local extension service. They would probably have a much better idea of local issues, local concerns, what those plants actually are. and maybe how to manage that, than I necessarily would from here. But I would certainly reach out, because if you are close to an area that has some of that selenium accumulation occurring, that's probably something that they've dealt with in other livestock species. They maybe wouldn't necessarily be able to maybe not have experience specifically with yaks, but a lot of that data, that map was kind of based off of cattle anyway. So, but if you're close to that, I would reach out maybe to a local extension service, because they would probably have the best idea of what's going on locally.
And I think, Bob, we deal with this down here in other weeds, that in a lot of instances, they'll avoid those plants whenever there's ample forage, and forage availability is not a problem. But as we see more drought conditions and that, then the risk of them consuming a toxic weed becomes higher. And perilla mint is the one that we deal with here in the fall, and as pastures come out of that August kind of drought, we see some losses from cattle consuming that toxic plant that they normally don't when there's plenty of forage. So it can be hit or miss on some of those, Bob, when you look at those. We have gone almost an hour and a half, which is longer than we typically would go. So I don't want to cut questions off, but if you've got any last minute questions for Dr. VanValin, please let us know, and either unmute or send us those. All right. I don't see any. Oh, I don't see any. So with that, thank you all for joining us. I put up there that our next session will be with Dr. Arnold on kind of diseases, EHD, anaplasm, and the new tick that is rapidly moving across the US. And Eric, it started up in your area. It was first found in New Jersey and has spread all the way to Missouri in a matter of about 3 years or 4 years. So certainly something that we wanted to share with everybody and get them aware of, because the symptoms are extremely similar to that of anaplasmosis, and it's the longhorned Asian tick. And so we'll talk more about that on March the 22nd, as well as some other diseases with Dr. Arnold. Be sure to let other folks know about the seminars, and they can just send me an email and I'll put them on the list. And about 2 days before, I'll send out the Zoom links to everybody on the list.